Halley's Comet March, and the man who wrote it, Patrick Moore, is sitting right opposite me now. Good evening, Patrick.
Good evening.
Well, actually, hang on. Aren't you a Hawley man?
Well, it should be Hawley, yes. I mean, no one quite knows how he pronounced it, but I think the odds are that he probably called it Hawley. It was probably Hawley. It just could have been Halley. It certainly wasn't Haley. Haley's a pop group. So I think Hawley's almost certainly right. And in the Hawley's Comic Society, we always call him Hawley.
I'm going to say you're a member of his fan club.
I was, in fact, a founder member of the Hawley's Comic Society. A society with no aims, no objects, and no ambitions. It does nothing at all except meet on licensed premises when it thinks it will, but it is the only completely useless society in the entire world, apart, of course, from all the nations.
What can I say? But the return of his comet was in fact one of the events which are covered in the New Sky at Night book.
Indeed, yes.
86,
because I covered that in two respects. I was a member of the International Hawley Watch. We were photographing the comet, and my particular job in that was to take small-scale pictures of the comet for measuring purposes. And, of course, I was doing the television broadcast when the Giotto probe actually went through the comet. And we were over at Darmstadt, the headquarters of the European Space Agency, and we did our section of the program from there. I may say we couldn't afford to do it all from there, and the Horizon program stepped in and did part of it from Greenwich, which I don't think worked very well, and I said it wouldn't. Nevertheless, I think at Darmstadt we got away with it. And, of course, when we went on the air that night, when the probe was approaching the comet, no one had any idea of what was going to happen. We didn't know what the comet was like inside. We didn't even know whether the spacecraft would be destroyed before it got within range.
It was hit, wasn't it?
We were really in the dark.
It was hit by something, wasn't it?
It was hit eventually by a piece of material, probably about the size of a grain of rice, and it knocked it out of the Strait, so we lost the camera at that stage. But, of course, the Giotto probe survived, and we're still in control of it. It's on its way back to the neighborhood of the Earth, and it'll be back near the Earth in 1990.
I always thought of Halley's comet as being like a dirty snowball.
Well, that's perfectly true.
But you call it the Black Comet.
Well, in point of fact, it was. You see, the theory was that by Oort and Whipple was that the comet was a kind of dirty snowball, and that, in fact, is perfectly correct. What we didn't know at the time was that there's rather more dirt than we expected, and the outer part of the comet was covered with blackish material, so the nucleus was black instead of being white and icy. But it doesn't affect the actual theory itself. And, of course, there were spurts of the ice melted underneath.
What is the black, though? What is the dirt?
It's dark, probably organic material. And I must say the one man who really got that right was Fred Hoyle. And Fred can be right when everybody else is wrong.
Yes, this is the extraordinary theory that possibly diseases can be visited upon our planet by going through the tail of the comet.
Well, with great respect to Professor Hoyle, whom I have the greatest respect for, I take that particular theory with a very large grain of cosmic salt. And in any case, this time we didn't go near enough to the comet. It wasn't within 40 million miles of us. And that, of course, is why it wasn't bright. Partly because it wasn't so near as it has been before, and partly because the Earth and the comet were in the wrong places at the wrong times. When the comet should have been brightest, it was right on the other side of the sun, and we couldn't see it at all. It was the worst return for 2,000 years, and as I said in the book, I complained bitterly about this. But in 1910, rather before my time, it was quite bright. And if you roll right back in the lists and look at the records of the year 837, it was then so bright it apparently cast shadows.
Really?
This time you were quite lucky to see it with the naked eye.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that the next return, 2061, which you may see, but I certainly won't, it's not going to be any better. If you wait for the return after that, 2134, I think it is, it'll be magnificent.
Oh, I'll put it in the diary.
Certainly.
Yes. But Giotto, as you say, is still out there somewhere. Is it going to be any more use to it?
It may be. It may be sent on to another comet. I think it may well be. Some of the equipment is still working, although unfortunately the camera's not. On the other hand, there's always the fascinating possibility of literally putting it into what we call a parking orbit round the Earth and simply leaving it there until we can go up and fish it down. I think that's not out of the question either. And I'd love to see Giotto again.
The other thing, of course, that is somewhere out there which came from here is Voyager 2.
Voyager 2.
Spacecraft.
Now,
That's
Voyager
amazing.
2 was launched in 1977. It went by Jupiter in 1979, and then Saturn in 1981, and we covered those in earlier Sky at Night programs and books. And then it went on to Uranus, and it bypassed Uranus in January 1986. And, of course, I was out at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the headquarters of the Space Agency, and we covered that for the Sky at Night, and we also have it in the book. And that was our most fascinating encounter. But we're not actually finished with Voyager 2 yet, because it's now on its way to the outermost planet, Neptune. It'll bypass Neptune next August, and we, of course, will be there with our team, so we'll bring back the on-the-spot records of what happens then, and that'll be in the next volume, in Volume 10.
Fantastic. Fantastic. But Uranus is a very strange place, isn't it? Haven't we
It's
now
a very
discovered it's
weird
even
world.
stranger than we thought?
It's a very weird world indeed. It's not like the Earth. It's what's called a gas giant. There's a comparatively small silicate nucleus surrounded by liquid and a lot of water and ammonia there. And what we actually see on Uranus is a layer of gas. We can't see the solid surface at all. You can just see Uranus with the naked eye if you know exactly where it is, but not very easily. And no Earth-based telescope will show very much on it. So we knew about the composition, a lot of hydrogen there, a lot of water, a lot of ammonia. We knew it had satellites. We knew 5. Voyager discovered 10 more.
Really?
And we also knew it had a system of thin, dark rings, quite unlike those lovely rings of Saturn. We didn't know whether it was a radio source. We didn't know whether it had a magnetic field. Actually, it has. It is a radio source. It does have a magnetic field. But for some extraordinary reason, the magnetic axis and the rotational axis are 60 degrees apart. And anyway, Uranus kind of rolls along on its orbit, on its side, so to speak. So at the moment, one of the poles is pointing toward the Earth and the Sun, and it's actually the hottest part on the entire planet. And if you ask me just why Uranus is like that, I can only say that I do not know, and neither does anybody else. And the other giants are not.
And I know you, Patrick, of old, that the one thing you do like to say when it is true is that you do not know.
I don't. I have no idea why Uranus behaves like that. Neptune doesn't, I may say.
It is extraordinary, though, and somehow I find it... it fills me with wonderment to think that that little thing, that Voyager 2, has been all that way. In fact, it's still out there somewhere. How many millions of miles has it travelled?
Well, when it got to Uranus, it had been in space for 7 years, 9 years, and it had covered over 1,000 million miles. And it got to Uranus less than 2 minutes late. British Rail, please copy.
Well, the picture's good.
The pictures were superb. And what I find so fascinating, when it was actually going in towards Uranus, more than 1,000 million miles away from us, a fault developed. And by remote control, that fault was corrected. So there was a running repair in space, which I think is quite incredible. And although, of course, it was launched in 1977, so it's now an old probe, we've come a long way since then, it's actually working as well now as it ever did, probably better. And that's all the more remarkable because very soon after it was launched, one particular pair of equipment failed. It's been operating on the backup ever since, and it's still going well. And I have no doubt at all that it will in fact send back pictures and results from Neptune just as good as they had been from the Earth if we and the giants. And then, after that, it's going to join Voyager 1 and Pioneers 10 and 11 in going permanently into space. It'll never come back, and millions or even hundreds or thousands of millions from years from now, unless it hits something, it may still be wandering among the stars, and unseen and unheard and untrackable. And just in case anybody finds it, it carries a plaque, and it carries some gramophone records and equipment to show where it came from. And I may say, in the equipment, there is in fact a record of a pop group. And therefore, if any being from Alpha Centauri B ever finds it, puts on a record, and here's the pop group, I'm quite sure they'll know enough to give Earth a very wide berth.
Should have a Patrick Bourne march on board. That's what it should have.
No, I hadn't thought of that one.
What about things more recently that you've been doing yourself? Didn't you see the Aurora Borealis?
I did. I think everyone saw that. And mind you, down here, and I was in Sussex at the time, it wasn't nearly so bright as it was further north. Because as you know, aurorae are due to electrified particles from the sun, which strike the upper atmosphere and make it glow. And
Don't you fix me with your beady eye and say, as you know?
No, of course you do. And of
But you
course,
shouldn't see it at all down here. I mean, it's very
well, you do.
rare,
I mean,
isn't it?
occasionally. I remember the lovely display on January the 25th, 26th, 1938, which I'm sure you don't remember. But the point is, because these particles are electrified, they tend to go toward the magnetic poles, and of course you don't see them so well from here as you do, for example, from Scotland. But Paul Doherty, the astronomical artist who illustrates all my books and all the television stuff too, including this New Sky at Night book, he lives in Stoke-on-Trent. And he said it was absolutely superb. You could read a newspaper by it and it cast shadows.
Good
There was
Lord.
nothing like that down in Sussex, I'm afraid.
No, I didn't see it at all because I was in France, and that's too far south.
No, it was seen in North France.
Was it?
And mind you, it was due to a very active area on the sun associated with a giant sunspot. Now, that sunspot is at the moment on the other side of the sun, so we can't see it, but it will be back. I think it's bound to last for several revolutions. It'll be back in the first 2 weeks of next month, and we could have another aurora. I don't actually think we'll have one as good as the last on March the 13th, because probably that spot group is now on the decline. But we could have an aurora display. If we don't, please don't blame me.
Do you do much stargazing at the moment? I mean,
A
for
great deal.
yourself?
Oh, a great deal. The point is, I was essentially a moon mapper. I was one of the NASA moon map team, and I was providing lunar charts in the days long before Apollo, and I think both the Russians and the Americans used them. But, of course, lunar cartography is now to a large extent completed. So I'm still an observer of the moon, and I still observe the planets. For example, for much of last year, the planet Mars was very well placed, almost as close to us as you can ever bet, and also nicely north in the sky. And just as we've been having odd weather here, so has Mars. Things have not been normal there at all. We didn't get the large, obscuring dust storms you usually get at that stage of the Martian calendar. But I've been observing that. So I do lunar and planetary observations still, and also I observe certain kinds of variable stars, which are exactly what their name implies. Stars which don't shine steadily in the way that the sun does, but brighten and fade, and amateurs keep watch on those to a large extent, and I'm invaded with what.
Do you frequently spend whole nights still in the observatory with your thermos flask?
Without trying to be funny, it depends entirely upon what's around. For example, when Mars was up, I was spending many, many hours in the dome. If, for example, when I get back tonight, if the skies are clear, I won't get home tonight for about after 11 o'clock, I think. Well, I will have lost Jupiter and Mars. They will have gone down behind that confounded tree in my neighbour's garden that I can do nothing about. The moon, of course, will be up later on, so I shall do a bit of variable star observation, see what it's like, and see whether it's good enough to do any lunar observation. And if not, I shall leave it at that.
So you can get what obviously an essential element for an astronomer is to be able to get by with very little sleep, is it?
I don't need a tremendous lot of sleep, but it all depends on the kind of astronomer you are. And don't forget that there are very many professional astronomers these days who hardly use telescopes at all. And when they do, they don't actually look through them. For example, this January, I was over in Chile, the large observatory there, the observatory of last year in Cerro Tolero, up in the Chilean Andes, 9,000 feet. And I must say the next Sky at Night program, the April one, is based on what we did out there. We're doing a program about it. Well, when I was there, I was with Dr. Richard West, the famous Danish astronomer. We were using the 100-inch reflector, and we actually saw Halley's Comet. Still there. Of course, it's excessively faint now, and visible only with the world's largest telescopes. But when I say saw it, what we actually did was to turn the telescope toward it, and then the image came up on a television screen, suitably enhanced by electronic equipment. You couldn't see it visually now. And it's very, very seldom that a professional astronomer actually puts his eye to the eye end of a telescope and looks through. Yeah. It's all done now by electronic gadgetry.
You began as a boy, didn't you? Was it 6 you started?
6 years old, 1929. And I picked up a book belonging to my mother, who was always interested, and read it through, and I went on from there.
Yes. When did you get your first telescope?
I borrowed a small telescope, and I had the sense then to borrow a pair of binoculars. And bear in mind that binoculars are very much better than a small telescope. And then I saved up all my birthday money and Christmas money and pocket money. And I did that for years. And I finally accumulated the princely sum of £7 10 shillings. I was then, I think, 10. And with that, I bought a 3-inch refractor. That's to say, a telescope with a lens or object glass to collect the light, which is 3 inches across. And I still have that telescope. I still use it, and I actually published my first paper with it. It is the ideal instrument with which to start. The problem is that I bought it for £7 10 shillings, and you wouldn't get it now for £300. Things are all altered so much.
Really?
And, I have so many letters from youngsters particularly who say, I'm interested in astronomy, and I want to buy a telescope. What do I get? And the answer is, unless you're prepared to spend £300 or £400, don't buy a telescope. Buy a pair of binoculars instead. These are little telescopes you get in camera shops, really aren't very much use, and I wouldn't recommend them. And I've been having a campaign against those because so many people have been disappointed in them. I edit the British monthly periodical Astronomy Now that comes out every month, and we've been having quite a campaign in that one.
Yeah. You see, you say you've still got that very first
I have indeed.
You still ride the old bicycle, which you had when you were a boy or a teenager. You've got a 35-year-old Ford Prefect car.
No, I'm afraid that was stolen. That's very sad.
Oh, gosh.
So I now drive around in my Triumph 2000, which is only about 20 years old.
Well, you've still got the 1908 typewriter, I have no doubt.
I was given that Woodstock typewriter when I was 8 years old by my father, and everything is done on it to this day. I wouldn't go without it for anything. I have got a reserve, my 1900 and 1100 wood.
Yeah. You see, this is the Patrick Moore image. How much are you aware of that image? The sort of extremely friendly, but slightly eccentric.
I don't think anything odd about me. I mean, apart from having webbed feet and fins, of course.
But how much are you aware of it? Do you ever play up to it?
No, not a bit. I'm just me.
I mean, do you suppose that if you hadn't been able to make a living out of astronomy via radio, television, writing books and so on, what do you think you'd be doing?
I think whatever I did, I was absolutely doomed to write from the word goes, what I ever wanted to do. You see, I missed my ordinary conventional university training because I was 16 when the war broke out, and knowing that having been ill an awful lot in my boyhood, I was going to have problems in passing the medical for the forces, I must admit, and it doesn't matter now after nearly 50 years, I swindled the medicals, swindled my age, got into the Air Force and flew. So I had a rather disturbed education altogether.
Yeah. But you think you'd be writing something?
Whatever I decided to do, I know that I would have written. I always wanted to write.
Yeah. You said you were at the Air Force. Am I right that you were taught to fly by Orville Wright? Or is
No,
this
you're wrong. No, you're not
stories?
correct in that. But when I was learning how to fly myself, and I'm going back now to the start of the war, when I went over under the Empire Air Training Scheme as a teenage cadet, I was more teen than they knew, I did in fact meet Orville Wright then. So I feel I rather span the ages. I met Orville Wright, who didn't actually die, till 1948. So I knew him, I only met him once. I knew the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, who's now very sadly dead. And of course the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong, I know well. But what I do find so entertaining is that actually Orville Wright, the first airman, and Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, could have met because their lives overlapped. They didn't, but they could have done.
Yes. What do you remember of Orville Wright?
Not a great deal. I only met him once for about half an hour, I suppose. But because he was an elderly man then. I remember it very well then.
I wonder whether he was a good pilot.
He didn't do very much flying after the end of the First World War. And, of course, his brother Wilbur, whom I didn't know, who died in 1912. I think Orville didn't do very much after that. And I may be wrong here. I didn't get to know him well enough, but I gather from a lot of people who did know him that he was very upset indeed at the way that his invention, his and Wilbur's invention of flight and heavier than air machines, had been turned to what he called military misuse. And I think he was thoroughly disheartened by that. And please don't take my word for this, because I'm not certain of my facts, but I don't think he ever piloted a plane after about 1920.
Really?
I don't think so, but I could be wrong, so please don't take my word for it.
Coming back just to this sort of the eccentricity that you have, one thing that you have not done with your image, pardon my using the word, it's awful, but you know what I mean, you have never actually made use of it, have you? I mean, I would have thought that
I didn't even know I had one, frankly.
Oh, come on, Patrick. But I would have thought that commercial people would have been queuing up to make use of Patrick Moore. Do they ask you?
I just wonder how many times I've been approached by advertisers to go on the air and advertise all kinds of things. Well, I don't for two reasons. First of all, I wouldn't want to. It's not me. Secondly, all this is on commercial radio and commercial television. I have no actual contract with the BBC at all, but I have got a gentleman's agreement that I don't go and do astronomy on any other wavelength. But of course, as far as I'm concerned, I'm thoroughly old-fashioned, and a gentleman's agreement is absolutely binding. I mean, a contract you can probably break. A gentleman's agreement you can't. Therefore, there's no question of my doing it.
Tell me about The Sky at Night. It began in 1957. Was it your idea?
It began in April 1957. It began with an idea not from me, but from Paul Johnstone, the television producer, who was a scientist inasmuch as he was an archaeologist, and interested in astronomy too. He had the idea of creating a program which we were going to call Star Map, and altered straight away to The Sky at Night. And the BBC approached me, and I said, this seemed a jolly good idea. So I submitted, I put some ideas forward. We met and talked about it.
How did they know
BBC
about you
said, I don't want to do broadcasts and things, and I published quite a lot of papers then, there's several books.
Yeah.
Because don't forget, I was only in my early 30s then. And the BBC said they'd then take the idea and put it on the air once every 4 weeks for 3 months and see how it went. That was 32 years ago, and we're still going. But it's not due to me. You see, we actually began in April 1957. And in October of the same year, I was still doing it. And, of course, up went Sputnik 1, the first Russian artificial satellite, and I just happened to be the man in possession, which is why I'm there now.
They must have had some inkling that there were going to be great strides made in astronomy there when they started the program, surely.
I'm not a bit sure that they were, because don't forget, in those days, before the space age began and altered everyone's ideas very quickly and very dramatically, astronomy was still very much of a minority, rather way out subject, unrelated to anything else. It wasn't actually, but people thought it was. And I don't think for a moment that the BBC had any real idea of the tremendous surge of interest that would come. And of course, although I was deeply interested myself, and I knew the interest was there, I couldn't foresee that either, because although I was quite sure that the first artificial satellite was going to go up, I was estimating all the way through until it actually happened. It was going to be about 1960, so I got it 2 or 3 years wrong. But also distinguished professional astronomers, including several observatory directors, who actually began either by talking to me or reading something I've written or reading a Sky at Night book or looking through my telescope or something like that. And I think that's my only justification, really.
You also enjoy debunking, don't you? You really do enjoy taking apart things like astrology and flying saucers and things of that sort.
Yes, I think I try and do it rather kindly. Years and years ago, I think it must have been about 1969, I did a BBC television programme called One Pair of Eyes. This was my look at the world, and we had the whole lot on, one after the other. Flat earthers, flying sorcerers, astrologers, people who speak the language of Venus, hollow globers, all the rest of them, one after the other. And I didn't try and debunk them, I merely let them talk, and it was, I think, very entertaining indeed. For example, we had the vicar who believed the sun to be cold, and unfortunately, during the broadcast, we set the vicarage alight by mistake. He took it very well.
Was it you who wrote a book back in the 50s? A spoof book about flying saucers?
No, the only books I've written not under my own name were Bureaucrats, How to Annoy Them, and The Twitmarsh File, written under my pen name of R.T. Fishall. And I may say I was exposed quite quickly. On the Twitmarsh File, I'm actually named on the back cover.
Because they've been chasing an astronomer, was it Cedric Allingham or something like that?
There were several famous flying saucer books. There was George Adamski, whom I knew, Celia Gowing, whom I met once.
Oh, he did exist, did he?
Oh, he existed. I met him, yes. And there was, Truman Bethurum, the American. He wrote a book called Aboard a Flying Saucer, describing his adventures aboard a flying saucer from the planet Venus, piloted by a beautiful lady named Mrs. Aura Raines. And this came out carefully entitled Non-Fiction, Account of a True Experience, and it sold very well. Unfortunately, his wife did not appreciate it. She promptly sued her husband for divorce, cited the lady from Venus, and she won.
What more
the first interplanetary scandal in history.
So, okay, what's the ambition? What's for Sky at Night and yourself?
Well, I think really, all I can say is really that I want to go on as I am, because I think we're interesting people. We get a good audience every time. I know that through no merit of mine, but simply the subject and the way we've been doing it, it has drawn a lot of people into astronomy, both on the amateur and the professional side. And I think all I can really hope now is to go on in the same way. I mean, there are various things I would have loved to have done, but never will. I mean, I would love to have gone into space myself as an observer, but quite apart from the fact that it would need a very massive rocket to launch me, of course I'm very much too old and not physically fit anyway. But I would love to have done that.
You'd be a very identified flying object.
I would love to go, but I'm afraid I won't do that. But I'm sure my successor on the Sky at Night will, whoever he may be.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening, and all power to you, because as you say, a lot of people get an enormous amount of enjoyment and information out of the programme, and the books that go with it, the 9th of which is just out, The Sky at Night, January 1985 through until September of 1988, published by Harrop. Patrick, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
There is a little tune, which you might well recognise. Marvellous piece of music that has introduced virtually, I think, every Sky at Night from the beginning.
Yes, we've only used another tune once, and that was on our last Hawley's Comet programme, where we played ourselves out with my own march, Hawley's Comet, that you played at the start of this programme. Otherwise, we always use the same one, Sibelius, At the Castle Gate, from the sweet Peleus and Melisande.